So while some Canadians think dense neighborhoods are maybe a good thing, when a project is proposed down the street from where you live, people get wary. Residents in the Douglas Park neighborhood in Regina are examining the pros and cons of a proposed 90-unit apartment building. Shara Kachula lives in the community.
I think the number one concern is that it's just too large for the space. The people that have lived here, this is a wealth of knowledge. They talk about doing all these fancy traffic reports and whatnot. All you need to do is ask any one of these neighbors who have lived here for their entire life or generations to know that in the winter time, the snow blows over those zones, the school zones, and fills in the 20th Avenue. You have one lane with rut to drop your kids off. People are double parked. There's nowhere to park because there's a school bus zone. There's 30 zones. You can't turn left on Park Street when there's a Libel Field game. You have a marathon that Kerr Place can't leave their place of residence when the people are running down. These are all things that we've welcomed into our neighborhood as recreational pursuits because that's what Douglas Park is all about. But it's added traffic, and that's just normal traffic. You have an area here that wants to throw in potentially 300 more people coming and going in one tiny little block, whose only access is a single lane into a parking lot that's barely larger than the size of a sidewalk. And the only exit is to a lane beside a church that in 20 years I've never even drove down because it's not really a roadway. And when you think about high density, and if you do read the OCP report, it talks about having to be near a prominent intersection. And a little laneway that's beside a church and a tiny little entrance, one-way, basically sidewalk to come into a parking lot is not a prominent intersection. That is not going to support 300 more people coming and going. If you were just to look at the drawing and look at how the traffic moves on a school day with a Libel Field game, with disc golf, with people walking, with people accessing cricket, and all those things happening at once, you'd be blown away with the thought of adding even 2 more cars.
Shara Kachula lives in the Douglas Park neighborhood in Regina. Andrew Stevens is a Regina City Councillor for Ward 3. Hello to you, Councillor Stevens.
Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. What's your take on this proposal?
Well, I should be clear that the details of this proposed development have not come to council as a whole for consideration. So my understanding is really what the media has reported and some very brief exchanges on social media and one phone call. I would say, though, just my impression initially is this is a pretty common package of concerns that residents in these kind of neighborhoods have presented to council in the past. When there is a shift in the kind of development that is proposed. So if you're going from typical bungalow style developments to 3, 4, 5, 6 stories, this is pretty common. I think it's an important process. I think it's important to listen to the community. I think it's also important for council to consider its commitment to increasing the number of units that are available in the market for rent or for ownership. And we also have commitments to densification and intensification across the city, but particularly in the zone within Ring Road. So I think there's a balance of interest. I think what the residents are presenting are perfectly valid. We need to do the proper research about the streetscape, about the community, the kind of services they want, but balance that with other concerns that might be coming from the policy table.
How can something specific like traffic be addressed in a proposal like this? When we hear the concerns about getting in and out of streets, how can something like traffic be addressed?
Well, I think we need to figure out what the existing concerns are. And if it's just a perception that there's a lot of cars and no parking, I think some of that actually has to be evaluated. It's not to discount what people are saying. I live within walking distance of Taylor Field. I see what they're describing around the school just down the street. I think part of it is this is just life in a city. We're not Hong Kong. We're not Toronto. So I think we have to balance what people consider to be too much traffic and high density with what's actually going on. So is it really a negative to see more cars and more people on the street? What does that potentially offer that community? What we also hear usually by way of phone calls and emails and not at these town halls are people who actually come out and support these kind of developments because they want more rental units. They want maybe condo development. They want busy streets. They want a development that has commercial on the ground floor. So we also see different perspectives from the community, and that's our challenge, is weighing, an actual evaluation of how this is going to change the nature of a street. Will it benefit the community? What are residents saying in favor and opposed to it, and why? And then we have to actually do some expert accounts as to what are the implications of getting more cars on the street and more accessibility by way of walking and people actually living in that community.
So what will be the City of Regina's approach to projects like this in general? I just want to step back a bit from this specific project. Overall, what do you think Regina's approach should be when it comes to density?
Our approach should be far more proactive than it is. I think we've already said at the council table, and there's a decade worth of policies that talk about the benefits of these kind of developments. They obviously have to be concerned with where they're actually situated in particular neighborhoods, but we've already given the green light, I think at least two councils now, to advance particular density and intensification targets. Now it's a question of how do we go about that? How do we front load a lot of the discussion into policies? And then when developers want to actually pursue these projects in accordance with what the market is asking for, as well as what the policy has outlined, do we have to stop at every development and engage in this kind of public consultation, or do we develop a framework in advance? And I would say it's the latter. I think it's important for us to have public consultation, but to develop policies that are very clear to the community, to establish neighborhoods, but also to the developers who are constructing these projects, that they know precisely what's permitted, there's no uncertainty along the way, and that these can advance in accordance with policies that have been approved democratically.
So would that framework help the city access federal money? Because the federal government they've set aside millions of dollars to help cities with what they're calling the missing middle. And so maybe not the 90-unit apartment building that we're talking about in Douglas Park, but looking more closely at the number of townhouses, fourplexes on a lot. Would that framework help you access federal government money?
It could. I'd have to look at the actual details. There has been some chatter from the federal government about tying that money to, creating a more streamlined approach to densification. That's typically aimed at larger metropolitan centers like Vancouver and Toronto, where there are major obstacles and densification and house prices are serious concerns. Does it make the same amount of sense in Regina? I would say yes, but absolutely. What we need to say is if there's $36 million on the table to advance principles and policies we've already approved, that's a huge compromise to say, no, the existing residential neighborhoods, the bungalow, that is more important than changing the scope of our city to make it livable and more affordable for everybody. I think we do need to consider the cost of losing that money if we don't have appropriate policies to advance what we've already said we're trying to advance. So I think it needs to be considered.
And what's exactly at stake for the city if you don't move forward on some projects like the one in Douglas Park or accessing the federal money to develop townhouses, fourplexes? What's at stake if the city doesn't move forward on some of these projects?
I think we can kind of take the ambition we have about intensification, density, and opening up space for different kinds of housing design, and we can flush those ideas down the toilet, to be perfectly honest. We can't at one point say we want to see these kind of developments in principle. We want to advance intensification and densification targets. And then when push comes to shove, we always back away, even though all of the principles and all of the rules that we've developed and all the money that we've spent into advancing these goals, if we're not going to pursue them and to make those tough decisions, I think we just need to make a decision now and stop pretending like we're trying to fill a vacant space, whether it's in the downtown or the surrounding neighborhoods or even in areas like Douglas Park. I think we just need to make that decision now and stop wasting everybody's time with these goals. Now, those concerns are certainly legitimate, and again, I'd have to see the specifics of how that development would disrupt and whether or not it is appropriate, even if we think about existing policies. But let's stop this game of approving the targets and then doing very little to nothing to advance them. It would actually just scare away developers who are otherwise not very interested in Regina, because we do not encourage this kind of work. They'll just completely give up, and we won't see this kind of development likely anywhere.
Councillor Stevens, I thank you for your time.
Anytime. Thank you very much.
I'm Leisha Garinsky, and you're listening to Blue Sky on CBC Radio 1. Today we are asking the question, is it time to move away from building single-family homes? The conversation today is about density in cities. Now, Tanya LaRose is a real estate agent in Saskatoon, and so she works closely with people who are trying to figure out exactly where they want to live. And so I asked her if it's appealing to a lot of her clients to choose a home where there might be multi-unit residences nearby.
Yes, well, obviously, especially with a certain level of income, it's definitely not appealing, because a lot of the time when that multifamily demographic is anywhere in the real estate industry, means lower income, higher crime, items that most homeowners don't want to invest into. But, like I said, we really are in a housing crisis. It's showing no signs of letting up. And personally speaking, I would much prefer to see more multifamily dwellings as opposed to the level of frustration and the level of homelessness, because a lot of people are even moving into motorhomes, and it's unfortunate to see.
It's Tanya LaRose, who's a real estate agent in Saskatoon. Chris joins us on the line from Regina. Hello, Chris.
Good afternoon, Alicia. Interesting topic. I live in a neighborhood in Regina where it's an older area, it's Rosemont, and we have quite a variety of housing options in this area. We've got single-family homes, a lot of smaller, older homes on big lots, and what we've seen, or what I've seen in the last few years, a lot of those older houses have been, knocked down, and newer, larger homes have been put in place. But we've also got duplexes, we've got apartment buildings scattered throughout the neighborhood. We've got a series of sort of smaller apartments. I guess they'd be like 8-suite units, and it seems to be a good mix. And I absolutely think that we need to support much greater densification, especially I think to prevent older neighborhoods from collapsing. Typically what you see happening, people age, the children move out, you have perhaps single elderly individuals living in a home, and just don't have the population in those neighborhoods to support shopping and things like that, and you get this hollowing out effect happening as people flee to the suburbs. And I think this is an opportunity for us to reinvigorate the older neighborhoods of our cities and also deal with the sprawl, which we just can't continue. I mean, it's just not sustainable. We've taken thousands of hectares of good farmland out of production in the post-war era, and we just can't continue that. So yeah, that's just my experience and my take on it.
Well, I appreciate your call, Chris. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Let's take a listen now to a voice note that we received.
Hi, Alicia. This is Bertrand Bartek. I'm an architect in Saskatoon, here to talk about density. Do we need to move away from single-family homes to create denser neighborhoods, and why? Well, to me, we don't really need to move away entirely from single-family homes. So when I think about why we want to create denser communities, I think about what I want the future to be for my family and my kids and myself. Do I envision an 8-lane highway, sprawling metropolis, strip malls, parking lots, and McMansions? Or do I envision walkable community, close to amenities, and sure, I'll have more neighbors, but it'll be much more affordable. When you think about what's at stake if Saskatoon doesn't increase density, you can look at many cities in North America at how wasteful they are, how spread out they are, how more dependent on cars are basically made to be because of the development pattern of the city. It's also much more expensive to run a city that way. It comes down to simple math. Fewer homes per acre results in fewer people paying for infrastructure, and as a result, it's higher property taxes for those people. For me, density is a no-brainer.
We are asking, is it time to move away from building single-family homes? Now, listening in on these conversations is Bob Patrick. He's chair of regional and urban planning at the U of S. I first met Bob actually out in the Evergreen neighborhood here in Saskatoon. It's a neighborhood that was planned, I guess, a bit differently than how neighborhoods were planned maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So, Bob, you've been listening in on all of these conversations. There's so much to talk about, but I do want to start in Evergreen. And for people who aren't in Saskatoon, what makes the neighborhood of Evergreen kind of unique?
Well, it's great to be on the show, and thanks very much, Leisha, for welcoming me. Well, Evergreen is, it's a newer neighborhood. It's one of the new neighborhoods post, 2015-ish, I would say. It's interesting in that it was developed with the intention of having a mix of housing, and we're hearing a lot about the missing middle, and Evergreen has plenty of middle. It has probably half or over half is classified as being in that missing middle that is duplex and 3-story walk-ups.
So it might be a little bit more affordable and attractive to a family. You think of newcomers and people with children. They may not want to be in an apartment building on the 80th floor or whatever. They'd like access to some green space. So I think that's why people are calling it the middle housing.
Yeah, and it has now over 10,000 people living there. It's growing quickly. Household size is almost 3 persons per household, which the downtown of Saskatoon is closer to 1. So it certainly has some sustainable features to it. Unfortunately, something like 85 people either take transit or walk or are able to bike to work. And so that number is very low given
85
the population.
Out of 10,000?
That's from Stats Canada 2021 stats. So that was the number that reported as their main means to work. So everyone else is hopping in a car.
And to remind people, Evergreen isn't in the core. This is quite on the edge of the city.
It is, and there's another development going on, further out than Evergreen.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to just go to a caller here. We've got James, who also lives in Saskatoon. Hi, James.
Hi, Lisa. Yes, as I was telling the person who answered the phone, I'm 75 years old. In 1987, my wife and I bought a revenue house. I live in it by myself now. It's over 1,650 square feet. And for most of my life, most of my adult life, I've lived with other people. In the 60s, I lived in revenue houses with anywhere from 7 to 10 people living in one house, and it was a co-living experience. I follow the co-op housing movement. What I would personally like to do with the house that I have now is actually lift it up, move it a bit, put something to double the size on it, and have it so that other probably permanently single people could co-live there, and it's convenient because I'm 3/4 of a block from the Sid Buckle Bridge, which means that I'm within walking distance of downtown, of Broadway. There's bad bus service, but that's because some people on the other side of the freeway didn't want buses going through their neighborhood, but that's another story. Anyway, I would like to see some kind of an initiative so that people like myself and other people could go and build things like Baba Yaga houses, where you have a group of people who are, going to be permanently single, who need share or would like to have shared accommodations.
James,
Baba Yaga houses.
it's interesting that you bring that up, because I know that there's units like that in Saskatoon on the west side, and it's not just single people. There are people with kids, and that idea of co-living. Maybe people who are living in that kind of situation, it's unique. It is a step further than just you're actually co-living. You're not just living in a unit that might share a wall. There's usually a shared kitchen space that people could hang out in, even if you've got your own unit.
Yeah. That's the way they used to call them hippie houses at one time.
So if it's working for folks in our city right now, maybe they could call us 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca.
Anyway, I would like to see that as an option for some of this investment. And on the federal investment, I would prefer that none of it went through Scott Moe's hands, because he's going to want to keep some of it. Anyway, thank you. Bye.
Well, I appreciate the call. Thanks so much. Bob, we know that a number of cities have signed these agreements directly with the federal government. The provincial governments are not involved. And cities, I think, which is Calgary yesterday, and Winnipeg has something in the works. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts on that the federal money on the table for cities, the incentive involves making changes to some zoning that does encourage density. What are your thoughts on the importance of that kind of federal investment, and is it moving us in the right direction or not?
Well, I think it absolutely is moving us in the right direction. The Dominion Housing Act goes back to 1935, the National Housing Act. CMHC took it over in about 1945. So the country has a long history of federal housing, social housing programs. That all came to an end in 1993 under the Mulroney government, and then the Chrétien government that followed sort of put the final nail in the coffin. And so we've gone for decades now without a social federal funding programs or social housing. And I know municipalities and provinces have been asking for it to come back, and certainly academics have. And so now it's back, and it's funny to hear some of the opposition to it. But it is wonderful. It's a kickstart. It's not ordering cities to do it. It's just giving cities the option of it.
And why is density such an important pillar of this for the federal government?
Well, density allows more housing in a smaller area of land. And so it makes sense for all of the reasons some of the earlier callers mentioned, for making better sense of infrastructure, making it easier to get to work if you're living in higher dense areas. Transit's going to work much better. So for this city, for example, the BRT is really key to the growth of the city, and it's key to the housing and putting more density in the transit stop areas.
I'll stop for a second here, Bob. I want to bring in a caller, Laura from Saskatoon. Hi, Laura.
Hello. I'm calling. I live in City Park, one of Saskatoon's old neighborhoods. I love my neighborhood so much. I'm very blessed to own my own little 2-bedroom bungalow, and I just love the big trees and being close to the river. And I guess I just wanted to say I do see a lot of benefit to increased density, like socially and environmentally and cost-wise and all the things that are being discussed here. I also think beauty is really important to human life, and heritage and connection to nature. So I guess my vote would be increased density in the newer neighborhoods. But yeah, I'd be really sad to see like all the old character homes get torn down here in neighborhoods like City Park. And that's actually, there were some neighbors who a few years ago, they had a petition going, and so there was a bylaw, I think it's a bylaw brought in, but anyways, in City Park there are rules about not building four-unit houses, and the reason for those rules are to protect the older houses, the little bungalows, which like a lot of developers just for the sake of money would love to tear down the older houses and build multi-unit dwellings. So, I guess that's just, I hope that these decisions can be made considering, preserving heritage and beauty and connection to nature. And connection to nature can be preserved in multi-unit dwellings as well. I know that. But I think all human beings need that.
It's such an important part of the conversation. Laura, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for having me on for the conversation.
I do think, Bob, when conversations about density come up, people are really passionate and they're often quite concerned about their neighborhoods and how new developments might change. I want to ask you about that, but I want to share an email that Kurt sent to us. It's related to what Laura brought up. So Kurt writes, many years ago when I lived in the Al Ritchie neighborhood in Regina, developers were buying land in the neighborhood and building very tall multifamily homes. Mm-hmm. The problem is that they affected neighbors' yards, preventing sunlight, and they looked ugly. The community got to get there and fought large multifamily housing from being built in that neighborhood. And now housing has to be a certain height with a certain amount of units. So that's from Kurt, who sent us an email. We'd almost need a whole show to talk about, what belongs in a neighborhood and what doesn't. But I'm just wondering, what are your initial thoughts when these very valid concerns are raised when we're talking about changing changing parts of a neighborhood?
Yeah, and it's a very important conversation, and this is where design guidelines come in. And so, developing design guidelines that suit the existing neighborhood is critical. A neighborhood with heritage-like homes. I mean, we lived on Main Street in Nutana, a lovely single-family, small lot, but not large lots, but small lots. And I understand the importance of keeping the character of neighborhoods, and new development can fit the character if the right design guidelines are in place. The facade of the building, the setback, you could convert to 3-story walk-ups even, provided that the facade of the building, and the footprint of the building is in keeping with the neighborhood. So it's sensitive. It requires city planning, design people to do their homework and to study the neighborhood. It doesn't mean that large block, 10-story buildings need to pop up everywhere. That's not what the federal government is saying. I don't believe what the government is saying is do your homework and then make an application. And so it's really up to the cities to decide where best to build. And I've been saying for years, and I teach this stuff, that the downtown of Saskatoon, there's just a tremendous opportunity there to continue some density in the downtown. Roughly there's about 3,000 people living in the downtown, and that number has actually dropped from 2020. So there's plenty of space and need to densify there. There's other neighborhoods that have some empty spaces that can be filled with appropriate housing and appropriate housing density. So it doesn't mean, and I hope this doesn't turn into a conversion of neighborhoods that are loved, that are single family neighborhoods that are well established. With the right design guidelines, we can actually do both.
I think a lot of people can understand why there would be a push for more housing in cities like Vancouver and Toronto when you look at just how expensive things are. And the argument for density, I think, makes sense to people in a large urban center. And so I'm wondering, for Saskatchewan cities, we've talked a lot about Regina and Saskatoon. What about even a place like Moose Jaw or Lloydminster? Like, is density important in smaller cities like that?
Well, it's a great question. My regional planning class, who I'm meeting in about half an hour, we're actually doing a project out in Rosthern right now. And believe it or not, Rosthern has a housing crisis. Talking to mayor and council there, they have zero vacancy, and yet they've got interest from companies to move in with lots of employees. And so this isn't just a big city question. You're right, Leisha. This is everywhere, everywhere Canada, and so housing. Why not some 3-story walk-ups? We also have a climate crisis globally, and so this is also about not just more housing. This is about solving the climate crisis. So I think funding from this program ought to be going, and cities need to be thinking about making more climate resilient homes, but really more climate resilient communities. So the students in my class now at working with Rosthern, are looking at making new development more climate resilient and converting existing housing to be more climate resilient.
Let's take a look at some of our emails that we got. So Donna writes, I don't believe that there is a housing shortage. There is a shortage of houses that meet the expectations of buyers. Most people want a large house, walk-in closets, etc., and won't consider buying an older home that needs renovations. If people don't want to work on a house, maybe they should consider buying a condo. That actually gives me quite a bit to think about. Homeowners, it's very expensive to renovate, and people, I think, are so squeezed right now with high interest rates and the high cost of living. Because there are a lot of homes in Saskatoon. I was shopping for one a few years ago, and there were a lot that needed to be renovated, and we had to make some pretty hard decisions as a family. Could we do that? So I think that's interesting. I'll share one more here from Kevin, who writes, my personal opinion as a lifelong Regina resident is that we are incredibly spoiled here in Canada with this expectation that many of us grow up with, that adulthood equals single-family detached home. I fully support projects like what is going on in Douglas Park. Ignore the NIMBY whiners, of course, NIMBY not in my backyard, and complainers. And then Anna writes, why not densify one of Regina's many downtown parking lots instead of Douglas Park? Also an interesting perspective. But, thinking about driving and vehicles, and you mentioned climate change, I do want to share with you one of the voice notes that we got talking about transit being one of the advantages of density.
Ihab Diab, I'm assistant professor at Department of Geography and Planning at USask. Well, I believe that urban density is a very important aspect that we should work on achieving in our cities. But we all should remember that density is only one aspect of the built environment, and we should strive not only to have higher densities, but also to improve diversity and design of our neighborhoods. And this can be done by having a mixed-use development and repurposing our streets to welcome the use of active transportation modes such as cycling and walking. And this will bring life back to our streets and shift our focus from moving cars to enhance people enjoyment of their neighborhoods. From transit planning perspective, having more diversity and density will also help us to build more efficient, frequent transit service, which will in turn attract more riders.
So Bob, I think... Bob, I can see you nodding a bit. I know you know Diab from the university. Transit density, I know we're having these corridor meetings in Saskatoon. The two do seem to go together, right? To strengthen a transit system, you need people where it's convenient for them to ride.
Absolutely, yeah, and the idea of mixed use, so not just adding houses, but thinking about community. So how to build a sustainable community, and there's plenty of knowledge out there. With city planners, they know how to do this. You need the investment side, but yes, mixed use, grocery store, downtown would be nice, but we need the people there to support it. So we heard a caller say lots of empty space in Regina. There's plenty in downtown Regina. It's really looking at where we live and how we want to live, and so adding density. Adding density doesn't mean 20-story buildings. It can mean much of what we already have in communities. 3- and 4-story walk-ups fit the middle, that missing middle, and more of that would be desirable. It does not need to be tall skyscrapers. In fact, I I would prefer to see more low-rise, mid-rise development in this city.
What about secondary suites? The provincial government is giving an incentive for people to put in secondary suites on their primary residences. And this could be anything from garden suites, basement suites with a whole separate entrance. So what are your thoughts on people adding those?
All of that's great. You know, laneway housing has been embraced by the city, Saskatoon, for a number of years now. And that's great development, because what it does is it doesn't really convert the neighborhood. It doesn't change the facade of the neighborhood, but it's making use of existing infrastructure. So you've got a laneway, you've got power, you've got sewer, you've got water. So it's a form of density that's almost invisible density. You don't notice it. It's not like a tall skyscraper going up in your neighborhood. So that sort of infill is wonderful. But again, design guidelines would make sure that the style of that building suits the existing neighborhood.
What's at stake if cities don't move forward with some of these ideas? I'm thinking again of the Douglas Park scenario that we shared with people right off the top. And you know, not entirely clear how aggressive Regina and Saskatoon will be, going after that federal money. What's at stake if cities don't find a way forward here?
Well, what's at stake is, this housing shortage that we're experiencing, not just in the big cities. You know, this funding is also for Indigenous communities. It's also for smaller communities like the Rostherns and smaller. And so what's at stake is, a continuation of our post-war development pattern, which seems to still dominate here on the prairies, which is to spread outward, more car dependency, fewer people walking and cycling, and transit not being as efficient as it could be. You know, we like to jump all over transit and blame the transit provider for poor service, but really they're trying to service a poor land use pattern. And so, this is sort of a federal government kick in the butt to say, come on, cities, here's some incentive. Now rethink the way you've been doing things. And it's timely.
I'm going to read a couple more emails here. So Keith writes, there are too many single-family copy-paste McMansions with manicured landscapes. They are not unique. They're just oversized boxes with a large ecological footprint to appease inflated egos. All new subdivisions should include smaller homes and tiny homes on smaller lots, along with high-density housing. Elijah writes, absolutely not in Douglas Park and in a schoolyard. Regina is a tiny city. There is no need for this. There are no amenities around here except a school. They could move it over behind Belfour High School, where there is a whole field that no one ever uses. They have grocery, doctor's offices, haircuts, restaurants. That would make more sense, and lots more room for parking. But no one wants it in Douglas Park. It will have people parking throughout the neighborhood. You can even put it out by the old Plains Hospital. When you look out there, you think there's so much land. That 90-unit building is too huge for that Douglas Park spot. Well, Elijah, I appreciate your email. Thank you so much to everyone who wrote us at bluesky@cbc.ca. And keep sending those voice notes. We love hearing your voices. You just record it on your app, on your phone, and email it to that same address, bluesky@cbc.ca. Bob Patrick, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Alicia.
We should take a trip to Evergreen again at some point. So thank you, everyone, for listening. I am Alicia Gravinsky. This is Blue Sky. We're back again tomorrow.